much, firstly, Alberto, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this seminar series. And thank you so much for attending. It's nice to see such a diverse audience, actually, with so many disciplines represented here. I'm so used to speaking to other psychologists, so it's nice to, as I was preparing this talk, to sort of rethink the way that I discuss some of the concepts that I'll be discussing. So I'm going to talk about the social psychology of faith and sexuality among gay and bisexual Muslim men. And I like to begin talks by really outlining what the point is. So what's the point? It's not just because I'm interested in it, although of course I'm very interested in this topic, but I feel that there should be some outcome. And I want to try and answer these questions that are projected on the screen. I hope you can see them. Sorry, I'm sort of in an awkward position here, having to look at the screen and ensure that you can see what's behind me. But firstly, I want to explore how gay Muslims might experience their religious and sexual identities, and indeed the relationships between these identities. What strategies gay Muslims might employ to try to maintain a sense of well-being in the face of possible threats. And what I mean by that will become more apparent when I outline the framework, the theoretical framework that I use in my work. And finally, how can we as a society support LGBT individuals of religious faith? So moving beyond Muslims in particular to individuals of religious faith who also identify as LGBT, so to reflect upon that question to some degree. So I hope to be able to address these questions throughout this talk. I'll begin by saying a few words about multiple identities and the social psychological scholarship in this area. I will then provide a very brief overview of British Muslim Pakistani gay men, because that's the specific case study that I focused on. Of course, when we talk about Muslims, we're talking about an enormous umbrella category, which is by no means homogeneous, and therefore I'll talk about this specific cultural group and the demographic features. I will then outline the theory, which is identity process theory, and it's a theory that seeks to integrate two principal levels of analysis. The individual level, that comes as no surprise, I'm a psychologist, I like to know what individuals are doing and thinking and how they're behaving, but also the individual who is embedded within a social world, within social contexts. And it's a theory that attempts to link the two. I shall present some themes that are derived from the qualitative studies that I've conducted over the years. And it is almost a decade, actually, of studies that I've been conducting. And I shall conclude with some thoughts on the intersections of faith and sexuality. Okay, so, homosexuality and Islam. What can we say about this vast topic? Well, firstly, as I said, it's very difficult to generalize about Islam, as it would be about any group, particularly about Islam, because it is a religious faith that is divided into various denominations, and there are many different interpretations of Islam, most notably the Sunni-Shia dichotomy. Religion, of course, is also entwined with local ethnic cultures, and we're talking about a faith or a series of denominations within Islam that is spread across continents. So ethnicity, culture also interact and produce different meanings and different understandings. An example of this, of course, is how homosexual practices in some cultures may be silently tolerated. It may even be viewed as part of the culture in some ways, just not talked about very often. Also, Sharia law is quite important because it is implemented to varying different degrees. It too is interpreted in different ways. In some countries, homosexuality or homosexual acts may be punished in a particular way. In others, where Sharia law is also enforced, it may not be really regarded in quite the same way. So that also gives rise, it's a source of information, a sort of prescriptive source of information about how one ought to respond legally to something like homosexuality. So that also informs understandings that exist within particular contexts. Just to give you an example, when I've spoken to some of my participants about why they feel that there are such challenges in reconciling their Islamic and their gay identities, they may well say something along the lines of, well, it's punishable by death in Iran, that must mean that it's wrong. So that's sometimes used as a source of information, a rationale for regarding it in this way. What a lot of scholars who have attempted to analyse this relationship say is that the mainstream Islamic stance on homosexuality seems to be fundamentally negative. And in substantiating this claim that the two are incompatible, Muslims may well draw upon the story of Lot from the Quran, which is also shared by other monotheistic faiths, as well as some hadiths, so some sayings and some accounts of the Prophet's life that appear to prohibit homosexuality. So these are ways of substantiating this claim, evidencing this claim, that it's wrong. It's important to point out that there is a reverse discourse that is emerging concerning the Islamic position on homosexuality. There are some scholars, such as Hugel and also Jamal, who seek to reinterpret what some of these passages in scripture might be referring to, a reinterpretation that may allow for the theological accommodation of homosexuality. There's also been an emergence of organisations and pressure groups that seek to reconcile the two identities, the two groups, such as Iman in the UK and Al-Fatiha in the US. I've been very heartened to see that there are a number of South Asian societies and pressure groups that have emerged that, while not defined primarily as faith organisations, certainly acknowledge the important role that faith plays. And I'd just like to single out Makinda, who's joined us today, and of course you lead a South Asian group here in Leicester, which seeks to do similar things there, to really provide a safe space in which people can be who they want to be, to lay claim to the identities that they see as being important. However, while some of this great work is going on, we must acknowledge that theological accommodation is still very much in its infancy. There are limited efforts, I think, in Islamic theology to really offer the resources to construct this narrative, and often a lot of opposition is faced by people within these groups. So it's by no means a straightforward process. And what we need is other people to validate our identities. Because if other people don't validate our identities, we remain on the margins. And that is something that we've observed to a large extent, at this stage at least, in these attempts at the reverse discourse. Right, so that's just a very brief whistle-stop tour of Islam and homosexuality. I want to now talk briefly about my case study, which is British Pakistani Muslim gay men, and just to provide some details about this group. So firstly, most Pakistanis are of Muslim faith. There are very small non-Muslim minorities in Pakistan. And just to give you an idea, it tends to be a very important identity. If you ask people how important their Muslim identity is in surveys, and what we find in some surveys is that 74% of Muslims see their religion as important, as more important than, say, their ethnic culture. They often cite the Islamic Ummah, so that's the sort of overarching Islamic community that cuts across national and ethnic identities, as being of fundamental importance. So it's an important identity for many Muslims, for many Pakistanis. We've defined it as a superordinate identity, therefore, that provides a sort of meaning system for everyday life. And studies describe the religio-cultural processes of heteronormativity and also compulsory heterosexuality that seem to be quite important, culturally speaking, within this specific ethnic group. We can say a lot about this ethnic and cultural group, and of course I'm omitting a lot of information here, but I want to point to one very important cultural tenet, and that is the cultural tenet of izzat, which is translated as honour, personal and cultural honour. It's closely entwined with faith as well. And it's very strictly enforced. An example of this is the fulfillment of the cultural expectation of a heterosexual, in many cases, arranged marriage. Now, by arranged marriage, I don't mean the same thing as forced marriage. They're quite delineable. They're very different phenomena. But the family typically plays a very important role in organising and in playing a part in the marriage of their children. The refusal to engage in a heterosexual marriage, in some cases an arranged marriage, can be regarded as a sort of contravention of izzat. And some of my participants have certainly provided accounts in interviews that show the outcomes and the consequences of contravening Izzat. Some people may be subject to psychological or physical abuse as a result of that. Some people, not everybody, some people. And this may be a fear that guides how they navigate their identities. So I want to move on now to think about sexuality and religion as a field. Now that we're mindful of the group that I'm looking at in this presentation, I want us to think about the broader literature in this area. There's a lot of work in sociology, but being a psychologist, I want to focus a little bit more on the psychological work and to show how I think what I'm presenting is slightly different from what's preceded it. So a lot of research in psychology has focused on specific areas and topics. It's provided snapshots into specific areas, like how counselling psychology clients who identify as LGB and of religious faith might well be guided during the therapeutic process. So there's a real focus there on the therapeutic process itself, on counselling and how to optimise counselling. For example, what happens also when the counsellor is of religious faith but not gay, but is actually working with somebody who fits within both of those categories. The nature of the dynamics within the therapeutic setting. There's been some excellent work on the types of religious tendencies and practices among LGB individuals of faith. Interesting to an extent, some of it's rather descriptive. It tells us that yes, people who identify as LGBT and of faith go to church X amount of times every week without really any insight into whether they actually listen to what's going on or whether it's more of a cultural practice. But that's the sort of thing that's been explored here, the tendencies, the ways in which religion is manifested among this group. And part of that research also includes the difference between having a spiritual attachment and engaging in institutionalized religious practices. So it's quite different. There's quite different phenomena. It's quite possible to perceive, to feel a personal spiritual relationship with God, but not to engage with the institutions, or vice versa. They're quite different phenomena. And what we found in a lot of research is that when people feel ostracized, when they feel excluded from the institutions, they may well redefine the nature of their relationship with their faith in primarily spiritual terms. And you can see why, because it excludes you from the group, but you maintain that sense of faith identity. And there's been some excellent work looking at similar things to what I'm looking at, sexuality and religion, but among specific groups. Gay Jews, gay Cypriots. I'm thinking about Konstantinos Filas's work in Cyprus. Various different groups have been examined, and I also hope to contribute a little bit to that literature with my presentation today. Now, I was by no means the first person to start to study the intersection between sexuality and religion among gay Muslims. Andrew Yip produced a lot of very important work in the early 2000s from a sociological perspective, addressing some of the questions I've listed here. So how individuals may construct a sexuality affirmative space for themselves. The tendency to queer religious text, to reinterpret religious text in a way that allows for the accommodation of their sexuality. And how family spaces may be managed. These are very sociological questions. But they didn't really allow us to understand what I was interested in. And that's the psychological processes that underpin how people engage with their identities. I'll say more about that. So we know little, actually, about the subjective experiences of gay and lesbian Muslims and the impact for their identity. I was quite dissatisfied with the snapshot insights that social sciences work seemed to provide. So I wanted to integrate this much more. And sociological work, and I am a great admirer of sociology, by the way, because I think we psychologists have an awful lot to learn from our friends in sociology, particularly around research methods. Not everything's about experiments and putting people in labs. But it does focus on the relational level. That's the primary unit of analysis. The social world, societal structure is the primary unit of analysis. I do admit, however, that the individual is my primary unit of analysis. What goes on in the individual's mind, how they're thinking, how they're engaging. So we wanted to understand how individuals might manage identities that are in conflict, and so we launched the project, Being Muslim, Being Gay, Representation identity and action. Now I want to say just a little bit about, just to provide a brief whistle-stop tour of psychological theories of multiple identities. And it is just a little snapshot here. I can't be very inclusive. I have to be selective. I want to outline some of the models that have been used and that could potentially be applied to this area. The first of which is the social identity complexity model. This is a model that describes various ways in which our identities intersect and the kinds of strategies that people use in order to make sense of their identities, to manage them. Some people compartmentalize their identities. They're gay in one context and they're Muslim in another. And those identities never come into contact because they're never really allowed to come into contact. Primarily because we engage at a group level in different contexts. The integrative model of social identity development and integration is a theory that defines integration and sees integration as the desirable end state. It's something that we all do. We eventually reach an integrative stage. That isn't my experience in the work that I've done. There are many, many people who simply haven't reached that stage and don't really want to reach it whatsoever. They'd much rather keep their identities separate. But again, this is focusing on the group level. It's about engaging in groups. It's about bringing groups together. Groups. Identity theory talks about roles. It sees our identities as roles that we occupy in society, like hats. You may wear one hat in one context and another hat in another. And they're quite mutable, the roles are. It's easy to shift between roles. So it emphasizes the fluidity of the identities and positions that we occupy, the roles that we occupy. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the cognitive dissonance theory, which is basically cognitive psychology. It's been deployed in contexts like why people continue to smoke when they know that there's a link between smoking and cancer. It's about separating the cognition, the behaviour out, because it's too threatening if they're together. You don't really want to think about your mortality, so you separate these things out. It's not really very helpful here, because while the other theories talk about groups excessively, this is only seeing the individual as functioning within a vacuum, a social vacuum, and that's problematic, I think. That's where our friends in sociology come in to the mix. So I was interested in what the social psychological mechanisms are that underpin how we construct our identities, how we become who we are, our identities consisting of multiple elements, and also how we manage potential threats. What do I mean by potential threats? Well, that's what I want to explain now. This is the theory that I use for my work, and it's called identity process theory. It's a theory that I've selected and that I've become quite passionate about because I think it does a very good job in actually acknowledging both the cognitive levels, because we do think, we are individuals, we do have brains, and we are distinctive from one another, but we are all embedded within cultural contexts, and it's a theory that tries to articulate the connection between those two levels. It's a model of how we construct our identities and how we respond when our identities are somehow challenged. Its basic premise is a cognitive one. It argues that we construct our identities through engaging with the social world. We encounter novel stimuli, we assimilate this stimuli to who we are, it comes and it forms part of who we are, and we make room for this new stimuli. For example, people often talk about coming out as gay at a particular age. They talk about coming out as gay when they realize that they were gay. That's what we mean, assimilating to your identity something like your sexuality. However, that doesn't just happen. You don't just assimilate things. Sometimes you have to juggle things in your identity a little bit, and some things shift in terms of their primacy. They become less central to who you are because you've assimilated that new phenomenon. Maybe the order of how important things are changes. So I want to give a slightly humorous example here, and I remember asking one of my participants in a study, so, tell me about some of the changes that occurred when you came out as gay. And he said to me, I stopped playing football. There's no point in that false pretense of coming across as masculine now. I was out as gay. That's what I mean. It's about shifting aspects of your identity because you've now assimilated something. The second process is evaluation, and it's very social, in the sense that we attribute meaning to our identities. We have to, through engagement with the social world, decide what it means to be gay, what it means to be Muslim, whether these are good things or bad things. And we learn about this through social representations, stereotypes, the media, ideology, engagements with other people. Now, these processes don't just function randomly. They function to create what we call desirable end states. There are certain guiding motives and goals that we have in our lives as human beings. It comes as no surprise that we seek feelings of self-esteem. We all want to feel self-esteem. You go into a popular psychology section of a bookstore, and there's always a book there, 7 Steps to Self-Esteem, and etc. It's something that we all want. We want self-esteem. And we will try to engage in those processes in ways that provide us with self-esteem. Otherwise, we face threat. Self-efficacy, we like to feel in control. When we're not in control of our environment, our identities, things around us, we feel threat. We want to feel in control. Competence. Now, something that's inevitable to the human condition is change. We all go through change. We face individual change. We grow older. We may well encounter illness. We form new relationships. We lose people. We gain people. All sorts of things happen. Change. Yet we still wake up every morning feeling that the same person is staring back at us in the mirror. We maintain a sense of continuity in the face of change. We feel that we're the same. Or we construct narratives to explain change. Belonging, we need to form part of social groups. This is nothing new. We need to feel that we're included. We invariably form part of groups. We are members of groups. Being gay and being Muslim can be groups, or they may not be, as I shall explain. And finally, coherence. We have multiple elements of our identity. And sometimes aspects of our identity become connected. Being an academic and being a musician may never really become connected in our minds because society doesn't really dictate that they should be connected. But for the reasons I've outlined, being gay and being Muslim do often become interconnected because there's a stance that's taken on their compatibility socially. So we internalize these messages, socially speaking. The theory argues that when any of these principles are somehow challenged, we face threat. That's what I mean by threat. We face threats to our sense of identity. But human beings, and what I like about the theory, is that it recognizes that we human beings are fairly resilient. We don't sit around and do nothing. We try to redress this problematic reality, to change the status quo by engaging in coping strategies. And strategies of this kind can function at different levels. Some of them are psychological. When something's so threatening to you, you may deny it. You may deny that you're gay. You may deny that there's a threat there. You don't allow it to gain access to your consciousness because you're denying it. On a more positive note, you may embrace this threat. You may accept the initial threat that occurs, but allow yourself time to begin that process of accommodating and assimilating that I talked about. We also are social beings. We engage with other people. We engage in interpersonal strategies. We may decide to isolate ourselves from people that threaten us. If you're alone, if you're not engaging with people, how can other people threaten you by saying things that challenge your identity? You may engage in a strategy called passing, which is when you feign membership in a group that you're not actually a part of. The classic example of somebody pretending to be heterosexual when actually they don't identify in that way at all. That is passing. And finally, we engage in intergroup strategies. This can include leaving your group. The group poses problems, just leave the group. Join another one. Or you may actually regroup with other people in a similar situation and form a pressure group. And actively engage with the diatribes that outgroups, level against you. So there's a multitude of ways in which we can cope, and I think this is a very useful theory for trying to articulate and understand the experiences of participants. And that's what I want to try to present today. So this just provides an insight, an overview actually, of some of the areas that I've looked at that I'll be reflecting on in this talk. Identity coherence among British Muslim Pakistani men, how people engage in gay spaces, also intergroup relations on the gay scene, how they engage with non-Muslims. These sorts of questions inform what I'm about to discuss in this talk. I'd like to say a few words about the methodological issues now. And I'll be drawing upon a series of studies, most notably the ones that I've just presented in the published work, conducted between 2008 and 2012. And there is a psychological focus on how people cognitively perceive and manage their identities, along the lines that I've just explained theoretically. But also I want to say something about the sociological concern with the development of relationships and how people engage with others. So I'm trying to articulate that connection between the social and the psychological. Approximately 74 people, possibly more actually, have engaged in the research process, so that's the number of participants. And they were aged between 18 to 28, so I'm interviewing fairly younger gay Muslims who may plausibly be regarded at slightly earlier stages of the coming out process. And something that's quite important is the fact that the vast majority of the participants in my studies weren't recruited within the sorts of social support networks that I talked about at the beginning, such as Iman. And that was a deliberate decision, because I wanted to look at some of the strategies that are employed that have been developed on an individual level, in an individual basis. So I didn't really want to hear some of the fairly well-rehearsed counter-arguments to the negative stereotypes that people would have encountered. I wanted to look at what people are doing at that stage of their socialization before they join pressure groups, etc. So a lot of what I'll be talking about must be must be considered in view of what I've just said, in view of where the participants were recruited. The work has been entirely qualitative, although we've now begun to collect some quantitative data that I won't present today, and it consists of individual interviews, and also one of the studies was a diary entry study, which was extremely insightful, and I shall talk a little bit more about that. And the research methods, the analytic techniques that I've used, are thematic analysis, because it allows for greater flexibility in how we use theory, but also an approach called IPA, Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis. I'm very pleased that I managed to say all of that. I practiced. And it is a phenomenological technique that explores subjectively, in a very bottom-up manner, how people are making sense of their identities. And for some of the questions that I was asking, that was more appropriate, but I can talk more about that. Right, so I'd like to now present some of the themes, and there are a few themes that I'd like to present. The first of which is a very basic one, and it's where we would expect to start with a study of this kind, and that is how people make sense of their gay identity in the first place. How is it that that process of assimilation accommodation is occurring, and evaluation, of course? How are people attributing meaning to their identities? What are they saying? Well, one of the most noteworthy findings, is how people were attributing, engaging in the attribution process, to what they were attributing their sexual orientation. So what we say in psychology is that when something remarkable happens, we try to attribute this occurrence to something. Attribution theory. And it was very interesting to observe how people were doing this. The first participant said, "Sometimes I think it's wrong to be like this, but then I guess I was born gay. It's the way I was born. Basically, God made me this way." So there's a very clear attribution of sexual orientation to God. It's God who has created this. For the second participant, it's slightly different, but the same process is observable. In the mosque, we're told that Satan tries to tempt Muslims because he is evil and he makes us do evil things. I know that doing gay things is evil, but I hope I'll change my ways and take the right path soon. It's all about temptation, really. Life is a big test. So in both cases, sexual orientation is being attributed externally, to an external source. And there is a theologically informed attribution that's being made. In one case, it is to God, in the other, it is to Satan. The implications of these attribution styles are considerable, because when something is defined as the work of God, and one proclaims one's love for God, it can be construed as something positive. Surely a loving God wouldn't have created me as gay if it's true, if everything that we've learned about God is true. But on the other hand, when it's viewed as something that is attributable to Satan, it's something that should be defined as a behavior, as something that can be eradicated. something from which we can distance ourselves. It isn't really defined as an identity at all. It's defined as a behaviour. The other noteworthy finding in terms of how people were making sense of their identity returns us to the big conundrum in social psychology, whether identities are group memberships, as some of the theorists I outlined would argue, or whether it's an individual trait, as some of the cognitive psychologists would argue, you know, the individual being in a vacuum, that sort of thing. Well, by the way, sorry, just before I present this extract, the italicized extracts, which have an H next to them, means a Hindu participant. Yes, this is a talk about Muslims, but I wanted to show you, just to contrast a little bit, what people of other faiths were saying, just to further contextualize my findings. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. What we find generally with the Muslim participants in my studies is that it's being defined, homosexuality is defined as an individual trait, as something that's very individual. Any sense of a group identity is eschewed, it's completely avoided. There isn't a sense of inclusion within a group here at all. And you can see that in these extracts. It's something I had to deal with that God should forgive me for, and I hope I'll change. It's a personal thing. It's not a group phenomenon at all, and I needed to get over it. I had nothing in common with gay guys. So it's not being constructed as a group identity at all. There's no sense of commonality. There's no sense of affiliation to other people who share their sexual orientation. This is my doing, same-sex behaviour, and I've got to deal with it. So again, it's very individualised. Yet if we return to the extract at the top, which is from a Hindu participant, we see a slightly different pattern of events. First thing I wanted to do was to meet other guys, to get to know them, you know, and it did help. There's that lingering idea that it's wrong, but I needed to get out more, to meet guys, to make friends, to get a boyfriend. So here we see a very different way of conceptualising this among different faith groups. There's something that's really challenging to identity that makes people want to avoid others in a similar situation. It almost makes it easier to distance oneself by viewing it as something that's mutable, that's changeable, that's about changing your behaviour rather than who you are. And this conceptualization fits their attribution style as well, because it's something that, you know, that either God has given me as an individual or Satan has tempted me as an individual into doing. And it's conducive to individual level strategies as well. So there's no point in forming a pressure group if you don't see it as a group phenomenon, because you have nothing in common with other people. Yeah. The second theme is about threats to coherence and how people manage the challenges of the two identities in their minds cognitively. So the way that we define coherence is the individual's subjective perception of compatibility between their identities. And let's have a look at the very compelling evidence that there is a threat to coherence. I know what I'm doing is wrong, and if I could choose, I wouldn't be gay, I would be straight. I know I'm going to go to hell for this, but I just can't help it. I tell you, my worlds are clashing. Often by looking at the metaphors that are used, you can see the extent of threat. People are talking about their worlds clashing. You know, this is the extent of the threat to coherence that's observable. People are talking about fighting with themselves. I was fighting with myself when I was little. It felt so right and so damn wrong at once. Crucially, the source of the threat here is because people are thinking and speaking from the perspective of their Muslim identity. They're using that as a lens for regarding other aspects of their faith. And it brings us back to what I said at the beginning about Islam constituting a meaning system for many of the people that I've spoken to. And people are really hoping to resolve this threat by simply turning straight, by eradicating the problematic aspect of their identity. It's not something that they want to accommodate. It's something they've assimilated, but they do not want to accommodate this because it poses severe threats for their Islamic identity. What do they do with their Islamic identity? Where do these threats originate from? Well, on the one hand, it's quite an individual phenomenon because people are talking about how they feel and their own subjective perceptions, but they also refer to the community, the perceived community stance on sexuality and Islam. They say, I knew my friends, family and community would hate me, like spit on me if they knew I were gay. So they're anticipating rejection. They're anticipating rejection because the two identities are in conflict. They're not compatible. There's an invocation here of shame, as I mentioned at the beginning, izzat coming in, and this entwining of culture and religion and faith. It's a dangerous thing for Pakistanis or Muslims in general. So there's a threat here at the individual and at the community levels. People don't want to jeopardize their sense of belonging within these communities, which, as we know, is an important principle. It's an important process. And you have to think, when you're being consistently bombarded with information that negativizes, that stigmatizes what you regard as an aspect of your identity that you cannot switch off, that cannot have positive implications for your self-esteem. And from the extracts, I think it's quite clear that it doesn't have very positive implications. People are feeling inadequate. They're feeling a negative self-image as a result of this. Yet people do cope. How do they try to maintain a sense of belonging within their Muslim group, knowing or feeling that there is an inherent incompatibility here? Well, there were some interesting attribution strategies that were used. I outlined some of them about the origins of their sexuality, but there were others that could contribute to this coping process, that could carve out a space within the Islamic community, because people wanted to be part of the community as well. Some respondents, by no means all of them, but it's noteworthy that some of them attributed their sexual identity to Britishness. So, of course, they have multiple identities, and they've decided that an important identity is their Muslim one, and so they attribute their sexual orientation to being British. The extract shows this. I'm gay because I was brought up here in Britain, but I reckon if I'd been brought up in Pakistan, then I would have turned out straight. I sort of fell into the gay culture. Now, some people may find this slightly ridiculous, but psychologically speaking, it's an attribution process. We do often scapegoat aspects of our own identity. We see the less important identities possibly as the causality of undesirable things in our sense of self. So it's all about the culture that's led me astray, rather than, one's Muslim identity that one wants to retain the purity of and its integrity. Here, you're gay for real, and that kind of sums that up. In the UK, because of the availability of gay clubs and easy sexual encounters with other men, it's easier to fall into that trap. So that's what's being argued here. Another interesting strategy for maintaining a sense of belonging within the group is to hyper-affiliate to the group. It's a term that I think illustrates this quite well. So sometimes people will compensate for their behaviour and their identity by really hyper-affiliating, by practicing, engaging in particular practices during Ramadan, for example, to compensate. So participants talked about basically Ramadan, I make sure I don't do anything gay. It's the one time I can really feel like a good Muslim. So really selecting periods during the Islamic calendar when one can feel much closer to Islam and actually distance oneself from one's perceived sins, activities that one perceives as being sinful. Now again, I've presented some extracts here from non-Muslims just as a point of comparison slightly, because I think that there's something specific about Islamic identity that poses a further challenge, and that is Islamophobia. So a lot of people reported Islamophobic prejudice and therefore felt that it was very difficult to integrate within the gay scene with other gay men because of their Islamic identity. And therefore, they found it quite difficult to exploit alternative sources of belonging. So remember what we were saying about IPT, identity process theory. When you feel that you don't receive that acceptance and inclusion from one of your groups, what you may do is derive those feelings from another group. But what the participants in my study seem to be saying is that they don't really have access to other groups. I'd be hated and kicked out of the community, or worse than that, who knows? I can't imagine being alone in the world. People feel that they would be alone in the world if they didn't have access to their ethnic and religious groups, which are, in many cases, closely entwined. I'm not networked, like well-connected or anything. I haven't got that sort of fall back on. And this is in contrast to some of the non-Muslims whom I've interviewed as well. As you can see, if the community leaves me, kicks me out, then to hell with them, I'm more myself with white guys anyway. So this idea that actually I can go on the gay scene and I feel a sense of belonging there. There's a family, my gay family, that are there wanting to welcome me. People feel, again, possibly because of the way they conceptualize their gay identity as an individual trait, because they've engaged in self-isolation, they haven't got access to those networks. because they feel that their Muslim identity is stigmatized on the gay scene, they feel that they're not as accepted. So there are a number of issues here that show the antecedents of threat. So in summary, people perceive a lack of social support, and they really can't align themselves with groups that can potentially provide them with a more positive stance on their sexuality. Because of course when we engage with groups, that's where we get our information from. If you engage with a group that has wonderful things to say about gay people, well, you may well feel self-esteem on the basis of your gay identity. If you never have any engagement with a group that can expose you to those positive images, you're likely to rely on the only images you have, which are negative ones, threatening self-esteem. Now, I couldn't possibly give a lecture without saying something on emotions, because I'm a psychologist. And again, looking at language and the metaphors that are used, we can actually gauge people's emotional experience to quite a large extent. We can see the sorts of emotions that people appear to be experiencing. It isn't the way that we usually tap into emotions. We usually connect people to various different gadgets and look at their blood pressure and their galvanic skin responses. But this is actually quite a nice alternative, looking at what people are actually saying. And what we can see, what I've been able to do is to link threats to particular principles and the kinds of emotional experiences that seem to be linked to them. So, people are experiencing shame and guilt. They experience fear when they feel that they may be excluded from their primary groups. When they are unable to perceive a sense of continuity over time, anger is a very common response. So what we can see on the basis of these extracts is that, yes, threat is there on a theoretical level, because continuity, self-esteem, coherence appear to be threatened. But actually well-being seems to be challenged as well on the basis of what people are saying. We can see very negative emotional experiences evidenced in these extracts, I believe. But of course, one of the things with qualitative work is we may not all interpret the qualitative data in the same way. But I think this is fairly compelling, at least in my view. Right, I think I'm going to miss this section out because it's kind of peripherally related to what I wanted to say, but I want to now just sort of begin to wrap up and start to challenge some of the assumptions that are observable in the psychology of sexuality, if you like, or the social psychology of sexual orientation, much of which is linked with some of the activism that has also occurred in psychology. So one of the assumptions in psychology is that when a group poses threats to who you are, when it challenges you psychologically, the most plausible logical response to that is to leave the group. I think many people here would agree that it seems fairly plausible. You just leave the group if it challenges you. Goodbye group and join another one. That is linked with theories like social identity theory, which talks about the exit option. And Andrew Yip, who's the sociologist I mentioned at the beginning, has also hypothesized that many Muslim men, gay men, may abandon their religious identity and engage in the exit option. But what I have found in my work is that this is perhaps less straightforward than many people have assumed. It's less straightforward because being a Muslim, in the words of this participant, is such an important part of my life. So if I had to choose between being gay and Muslim, I'd just be a Muslim and not be gay. I often question if I'm really gay or not. So what we see also, and it makes researching identity very, very difficult, is that people don't even identify in a very consistent way in the same interview. So you recruit them because they say they're gay, but later on they say, well, actually, maybe I'm not gay after all because I'm a Muslim. That's the important part of my identity. So there's a shift there in language, which is why we can't necessarily take everything that people say at face value. We have to look at the connections between what they're saying. I'm a Muslim, so how can I be gay? Stopping the gay thing is doable in time, but losing my faith is sort of end of the road. It is by no means easy to leave one's Muslim in-group because it is an important part of identity. Many of the other identities are closely entwined with that primary superordinate identity, such as being Pakistani. So the exit option may be a bit of an assumption. The second assumption in psychology is what I alluded to earlier on, that we compartmentalize our identities. If there are two identities that are challenging, we just separate them out into boxes in our minds So I'm in gay pride, I'm gay, and I don't even think about being Muslim. In the mosque on a Friday, I'm a Muslim and I don't think about being gay. And those two identities simply cannot come into contact. If only it were that simple. If only one could do that. But other people tend not to let sleeping dogs lie, do they? People do tend to flag up anomalies in our identity, or perceived anomalies. In some of the interviews I've conducted, that seems a plausible strategy, but again, later on in the interviews, people do describe contexts where the two identities are forced into contact with one another. Sometimes it just hits me. How does God see me when I'm in this place, the mosque? I feel like I don't have the right to be here, to be in the mosque. And in reference to a heterosexual arranged marriage, which was on the cards for many of my participants, actually, yes, actually, when my parents mention me getting married, I just freeze, because it shows that I can't do what other Muslims do, get married because I'm gay. So again, that's a context where faith and sexuality come into contact, because getting married is often perceived as exercising one's faith in the correct manner, correctly. And of course, being gay has implications for that. So that can be rather difficult as well. It's not as easy as some of the theories would argue to compartmentalise. At least it's not an effective long-term strategy. The third and final assumption I want to contradict slightly and to challenge is this notion that coming out is invariably a very positive psychological step in our sexual identity development. I personally think it is, for me, but a lot of people might well disagree with me on that, and I think certainly a lot of my participants would disagree with me on that. It needs to be regarded in its social context. We have to think about how the very act of coming out may affect the other principles of identity that I outlined at the very beginning. That's what I want us to be mindful of. Okay, fine, you may well resolve the threat because you told other people, and you may well gain exposure to positive imagery, but what about continuity? What about the other aspects of identity that might be challenged? What people describe how this is actually quite a negative process. You bring shame on your family, that's the dangerous things. People talk about the kinds of terms and words that are used to describe homosexuality within their heritage languages, which is by no means a trivial matter. So how do they communicate this to their family in the first place in their heritage language? Well, they can't use words like homosexual or gay because they're not really within the lexicon, they're not accessible socially or cognitively, actually, to the people that they're trying to come out to. So they have to use a very specific form of language that can make it very difficult, which is actually why I've been heartened to see some of the very positive efforts of members of the support groups I've talked about that have provided YouTube videos of people coming out in their own language, and actually, that's extremely helpful because it provides a language for doing this in a way that can be understood, that's likely to be received in a more positive manner. So we should, I think, culturally also acknowledge that coming out is rather problematic for a lot of people, and particularly on the gay scene, individuals may face derision, they may face denigration from other gay people when they learn that one is not out of the closet. Why are you still in the closet at age 28? That's very abnormal. You should have surely come out by now. That sort of thing. And there should be much more acknowledgement of some of the specific challenges, and that people require more time and certainly the social, psychological, linguistic resources to have these conversations. So it's an assumption I want to challenge. Concluding. I'm going to conclude now. So firstly, I want to say qualitative methods are great, and are there any psychologists here? Well, that's good. I'm preaching to the converted, I think, there. But it can be a dangerous thing to say to psychologists, but I think qualitative methods do allow us to do an awful lot and to really decipher some of these complex psychological processes, to look at language, to go beyond the superficial level, to look at contextualized understandings. So I found this a very, very useful way of approaching this topic. I want to just sum up some of the things that I've talked about here. So individuals' awareness of their religious and cultural homophobia can give rise to identity threat and very negative emotions, severely challenging their well-being. This belief that their gay identity contravenes very key norms of a superordinate identity, an identity that's just so important, that constitutes the meaning system, that's embedded within many other group memberships, that's central to who people are. And so the assimilation and accommodation of the gay identity can really be a challenge. And I think we need to look at ways of rendering this easier for the participants, supporting the individuals in this process. What we also find, I think by virtue of how people are conceptualizing their gay identity, is a focus on deflection strategies. What we mean by deflection strategies are those strategies that try to undervalue or undermine the importance of being gay. So it's something that people do to sort of forget about it or to separate it out in their minds or attempt to do that. And we know from a lot of psychological work that it tends not to be very effective in the long term for the reasons I've outlined, but also because people end up engaging in a spiral of individual negativity. So some people talked about self-harming to alleviate their feelings of guilt. They were unable really to engage with others and to derive support. What's noteworthy is that it's sometimes doubtful that people are even thinking about their gay identity, what I'm calling their gay identity, as an identity. At times they are, at other times they're talking about it as a behaviour, because you can change behaviours. At least that's the idea. There's more of an optimism, a hope that it's something that can be changed in the long term. So what are the implications of this? Well, I think, firstly, we need to engage community members on issues surrounding sexual diversity, moving towards greater theological accommodation. It's challenging. I'm not entirely sure how we might do that, but we should have a conversation about that. At a societal level, we need to acknowledge the tensions between these identities and support one another. And I'm referring here, with my activist hat on, really for people on the gay scene and other people within the sexual in-group, the gay in-group, to be more understanding about the diversity of LGBT communities. People sometimes think about LGBT communities as being very, very supportive of one another. I was going to say happy-clappy, but it's not really. There's a lot of division on a number of different levels that need to be addressed, and this kind of adds a further layer of complexity to a very problematic situation. Creating safe spaces for negotiating religious and sexual identities. I've noted one very safe space, which is Makinda's group for South Asians here in Leicester. There are other groups that are emerging in other parts of the country. These are the sorts of safe spaces that we're talking about, and of course this requires this requires resources, and I think it's very important indeed. And psychotherapeutic interventions ought to focus on questions around coherence, self-esteem and continuity, because we can see how those principles may be challenged. Perhaps if they constitute our starting point, we may actually be able to support people psychologically as they embark upon this process of assimilation, accommodation and evaluation. And of course, I couldn't possibly give a lecture being a professor of psychology and sexual health without mentioning sexual health. And because there are connections with issues around sexual health, sexual risk-taking, depression, mental health, that are very closely entwined with the issue of self-acceptance. And so we may be facing a number of challenges, not to mention exposure to STIs and the HIV epidemic in this country that continues to, HIV incidence that continues to rise every year. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Rusi, for a very stimulating and broad and rich paper. And I think you've given us lots to think about. So hopefully your paper will generate lively discussion. Please do sit down.
Thank you, sit down, thank you.
We'll let you slightly off the hook.
Okay.
So you can, so you can sit down.